Right, so we continue to shine a spotlight on the weather phenomenon in and around the country. After several consecutive days of heavy rainfall, flooding continues to affect parts of Limpopo and Mpumalanga, disrupting roads, schools, businesses and travel in some instances. But similar flooding has also been reported in Mozambique, just highlighting a broader regional weather system. But authorities are urging caution, especially in lower-lying areas, as more rain is possible. All this whilst teams remain on high alert in parts of the Eastern Cape, of course, after several days of hot, dry and windy conditions that fueled wildfires in the region. So we are now going to be joined by Professor Jennifer Fitchett, Professor of Physical Geography, Head of Postgraduate Studies and Research Development at University of Witwatersrand, ready to explain what's driving these conditions and what people need to know. Prof. Jennifer, on that note, good morning and thank you for making time to chat with us this morning.
Morning, Lisa. Morning to your viewers.
We're obviously trying to look at what has transpired and perhaps you can just explain why we are having concurrent floods in the northern region of the country, dry conditions and fires in the southern parts of the country at the very same time.
So at the moment, we're experiencing a Leninia event, and when South Africa experiences the effects of a Leninia, we typically have flooding in our northern regions and dry conditions in the southwestern Cape and through the Garden Route. Right at the moment, that La Nina is coupled with a neutral phase in our more local climate forcing mechanisms. So that's our Indian Ocean dipole within the Indian Ocean and the southern annular mode, which controls our mid-latitude cyclones that make their way through to the Cape. And so that means that although El Nino and La Nina are features of the Pacific Ocean, and we are very far away from the Pacific Ocean, it's having a more direct influence on us. So it's not the strongest La Nina that we've experienced, but because it hasn't been coupled with a positive or negative phase in either of our two much more local forcing mechanisms, we're experiencing a very clear La Nina pattern at the moment.
So, I mean, we're obviously seeing the real-time damage as well, and with the flooding really being so high, perhaps you could talk to the long-term accumulation of moisture, the ground saturation, why it's been compounded by the amount of rainfall that we're seeing in these provinces.
Yes, absolutely. So over the past 2 months of summer, we've seen very high levels of rainfall throughout most of the northern half of South Africa. And as that rainfall accumulates, so our soils become saturated, our groundwater level rises. And so it means that even if we have relatively small amounts of rainfall, the propensity for rivers filling and then flooding is much greater. Now, when we have a very strong tropical low, as we've had over the past week, we do have much larger amounts of rainfall, between 50 and 100 millimeters a day in some locations. That means that those rivers are going to fill up very, very quickly, and that increases the chance of flooding, such as we've seen across regions of KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo province over the past week.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously looking at modes of data collection that has been available in the build-up to all of this, and as we're tracking the weather patterns and what has transpired, when we're asking, with the use of technology and our advanced systems, how far in advance were events like this predicted by the climate models, the amount of rainfall as well? I mean, obviously, this impacts the ordinary man on the ground, farmers as well. They had no chance to mitigate against some of what has transpired in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big challenges with this particular low pressure system is that the models were in complete disagreement right up until last Sunday morning. So at that point, we'd already had a full 24 hours of rain up in Limpopo. I was in the Hoedspruit region myself, and I was watching river levels increase. And it was only at that point that all of the major weather models across the world came to agreement. It's something that's been reported on already by meteorologists. It's something that climate scientists, we were watching very closely in the lead up to the storm event, was that unusually we had this very, very mixed message coming from the different climate models. And that's because each of these climate models are trained with different mathematical functions, with different physics of the atmosphere. Now, ordinarily, they would come to a level of agreement at a certain point in the lead up to a storm, but our tropical storms are difficult to forecast at the best of times, and in this case, there was large disagreement. And so what that meant was, depending on which source of weather information you were getting, depending on which weather forecast you were receiving, you might have had very different forecasts. In some regions, as much as a difference between 300 millimeters or 10 millimeters for a particular day. And so that, as you said, makes it very, very difficult for people to be able to make plans and to be able to put in place those very short-term adaptations. It's also worth saying, though, that when we're talking about these major flooding events, there's very little that we can do to effectively prevent damage in a very extreme climate event. And so the effects that we're seeing of bridges being washed away, there's very little we could have done in the week leading up to an event like that, even if all of the models had been in agreement.
Because, Prof, I actually wanted to look at the issue or shine a spotlight on climate change at large and look at natural disasters versus human amplified disasters as well, the danger and how we're labeling all of this. But even if we look at the roads, the bridges, the infrastructure at large, particularly in rural areas, they were obviously built for a climate that happened 30 years ago. How relevant or what lack of upgrades exists at this point that would have exacerbated the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're living in a warming climate, and that means that the likelihood and the severity of extreme climate events is greater than it was a century ago. It was greater than it was even a couple of decades ago. So we are seeing more and more unpredictable weather phenomena, and we're seeing more severe impacts of extreme climate events. We saw that with the Durban floods. We're seeing it again right now. In both cases, we've got a level 10 warning from the South African Weather Service, which is their highest level of warning they have. And that does have an anthropogenic component, and climate modelers are in the process of doing attribution studies to be able to directly link that to climate change. But as you correctly say, we need to then be looking at whether our infrastructure has the capacity to deal with these extreme climate events. And the challenge in a country such as South Africa, and particularly in our rural areas, is that you're always going to be weighing up meeting very immediate needs of housing, of sanitation, of schooling, against those needs of being able to adapt for a future climate. And these extreme storm events, if we're talking about the Limpopo region, if we're talking about, for example, the Mopani District Municipality, they've had extreme flooding events now. They've had extreme flooding events in 2012, and they had the extreme floods of 2000. So these are less frequent events, but as we can see, the impacts of those events in terms of cutting off communities, in terms of very severe risk to life if people have to cross rivers and cross inundated areas to be able to get food, are very severe. And so it is a real challenge then to be able to upgrade roads and bridges to be able to try and survive these types of storm events, while at the same time allocating sufficient financial support to all of our other very pressing day-to-day needs.
Yeah, people, livestock, animals, all have been impacted. And I mean, I'm just trying to imagine a best case scenario here, because based on the model discrepancies at this point, what are the best practices? What early warning systems should have been in place? Where do they usually fail, especially in poorer communities as well? What's that safest approach that's needed at this point, perhaps so we can learn as we navigate and safeguard against the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think part of the problem is that you're weighing up, do you take the worst case scenario from a model and evacuate regions in advance, but then it turns out that that particular model is incorrect and you've put a lot of people's own personal finances into evacuating an area, into turning away tourists from major lodges, in changing your strategy in terms of what you want to be doing on farms with spraying your crops, for example. Or do we go the other route where we say we hope that the worst won't happen? Now, in cases where our climate models are in better agreement and where we have more definitive forecasts in the lead up, it makes it much easier to be able to say that we should be preparing for the worst. I think that this particular storm is an excellent case study and one that we should be looking at very closely in terms of how we make those weigh-ups, in terms of being able to protect people against the worst case scenario, but also allowing them to go about their day-to-day lives. At a very basic level, I think what is important is that where there are forecasts of a strong storm event, even where the models are in disagreement, making sure that communities are able to get access to food and fresh water is very important. And of course, if we're talking about rural communities that have very little access to large amounts of capital, it's not possible to go to a grocery store and stock up on large amounts of bottled water and groceries. So thinking about how else we're able to supply communities on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis with the types of basic necessities that they need so that they're not putting their lives at risk during a storm of this nature.
Well, Prof, it's happening in real time. We're going to have to obviously monitor what happens from here into. But thank you for your time at this hour and for your invaluable insights. Emergency teams remain active across affected areas. Residents advised to stay alert, limit unnecessary travel, and really just keep up to date with all the official alerts as conditions continue to develop. And Professor Jennifer Fitchett really just weighing in to explain the science behind it all.